The meeting where I was erased IVE replayed that board meeting in my mind more times than I care to admit. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind where Manhattan feels colder than the forecast suggests. The kind of cold that settles into your bones before you even reach the office. Remember standing in front of the mirror that morning, smoothing the lapels of my navy blazer. I had chosen it deliberately. Structured. Calm. Controlled. The way I needed to feel, because that day, I was presenting the Q3 financial recovery strategy. The one I had built from scratch over 6 relentless months. 6 months of 11 p.m. spreadsheets. 6 months of canceled dinners. 6 months of quietly fixing mistakes that weren't mine. But when I stepped into the executive conference room on the 42nd floor, something felt off. The boardroom was all glass and steel. 12 leather chairs. A long walnut table polished to a shine. City skyline stretching behind us like a corporate postcard. My boss, Richard, was already seated at the head of the table. He didn't look at me when I walked in. That should have been my first warning. I've worked in corporate finance for 15 years. You develop instincts. You can feel shifts in temperature that have nothing to do with HVAC. Richard had hired me 3 years earlier as Senior Director of Strategic Finance. At the time, he called me his secret weapon. Those were his words. "You're going to clean this place up," he'd told me during my second week, and I did. When I joined, the company was bleeding money through operational inefficiencies. Forecasting was unreliable. Reporting delays were routine. Vendor contracts were outdated. Rebuilt the forecasting model. I renegotiated supplier agreements, cut $18 million in unnecessary expenses in my first year alone. But success in corporate America has a short memory. Especially when it's attached to a woman who doesn't golf with the CEO. The board members filtered in. 8 of them. Mostly men in their 50s and 60s. A few polite smiles. A few distracted nods. Connected my laptop to the screen. My presentation title appeared **** Q3 Financial Stabilization and Forward Growth Strategy. I had rehearsed it. Not because I doubted the numbers, but because I knew perception mattered as much as performance. Richard cleared his throat, and then he said it, "I'll handle this one." I froze. I thought I misheard him. "I've been closely overseeing the financial restructuring," he continued, folding his hands calmly. "So I'll walk the board through our progress." Our progress. I felt my pulse in my ears. I glanced at him, waiting for the correction. The acknowledgement. Emily led this effort. It didn't come. He began flipping through my slides. Slide 1. My analysis. Slide 2. My projections of Slide 3. My recovery roadmap. He spoke in broad strokes. Vague language. Strategic buzzwords. Skipped over the detailed cost modeling entirely, the section I had spent weeks perfecting. One of the board members, David, interrupted. "What changed in August?" The burn rate dropped significantly. That was my model. My moment. Richard leaned back slightly and said, almost casually, "We made some internal adjustments." I opened my mouth to speak. He didn't look at me, and then came the sentence that shifted everything. "To be transparent," Richard said, his voice measured, "Emily's role has been more supportive in this process. She contributed to the data gathering, but the strategic direction came from my office." Supportive data gathering. The strategic direction came from my office. The room went very still. I felt heat rise up my neck. My hands went cold. Contributed nothing. He hadn't used those exact words yet, but he didn't need to. I had built that strategy, every projection, every contingency plan, every restructuring lever, mine, and in less than 30 seconds, I had been reduced to a footnote. David looked confused. Another board member glanced at me briefly, then back at Richard. No one challenged him. It's how it happens, not with shouting, not with drama, with omission, with erasure. Sat there, perfectly composed, because corporate humiliation is a silent sport. Richard clicked to the final slide, the 5-year growth projection. The numbers were bold, confident, aggressive, and slightly altered. My stomach dropped. That wasn't my 5-year model. Had adjusted the revenue forecast upward, not by a little, by 14%, without adjusting risk assumptions. Without adjusting cash flow contingencies, IT looked impressive. IT was also dangerous. Based on these projections, Richard concluded smoothly, we're positioned for substantial expansion by mid-next year. There it was, applause, light, polite, corporate, and then he said it, of course, this level of strategic modeling requires executive oversight. It's not something that can be handled at every level. He didn't look at me, he didn't have to, every level. I understood exactly what he meant. David leaned forward. Emily, he said slowly, you built the original recovery model, correct? There was a pause. Richard's jaw tightened, and in that moment, I had a choice, stay silent or speak. I folded my hands carefully on the table, and I said, evenly, yes. I did. Richard smiled, thin, controlled. Emily contributed to portions of the analysis, he corrected, contributed, like I had brought coffee, like I had formatted spreadsheets, like I hadn't carried this company through its worst financial quarter in a decade. And that's when he said it, casually, almost dismissively, she didn't really drive the strategy. Didn't drive the strategy. I felt something inside me settle, not break, settle, because I knew something he didn't. The financial report for Q3, the audited one, was being finalized that afternoon. And it didn't reflect his revised projections, IT reflected mine. And numbers don't care about hierarchy, they don't care about ego, they don't care who sits at the head of the table. They only tell the truth. I didn't defend myself, I didn't argue, I didn't need to, because in less than 48 hours, the full financial report would go to the board, and when it did, it would show precisely who drove the strategy, and who merely presented it. I closed my laptop slowly as the meeting adjourned. Richard leaned toward me just before standing. You need to learn how this works, he murmured quietly. Visibility comes with time. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel intimidated. I felt certain, because I knew what the numbers would say, and numbers don't lie. When the numbers started talking, if you've never waited for an audited financial report to be released, let me tell you something, it feels like standing on train tracks, hearing something in the distance, and not knowing whether it's coming toward you or past you. The board meeting was on Tuesday. The audited Q3 report was scheduled for distribution Thursday at 4:00 p.m. 48 hours. Went back to my office after the meeting and closed the door. Didn't cry, didn't rage. I opened my model.my original forecast file was timestamped, archived, and backed up on 3 separate servers. I am not dramatic, but I am meticulous. Every adjustment I had made over 6 months was documented. Version history. Email trails, Slack confirmations, late-night approvals, and most importantly, risk flags. Richard had removed 3 of them from the presentation version: vendor renegotiation volatility, seasonal revenue compression, debt restructuring sensitivity window. Those flags weren't pessimistic. They were responsible. Without them, the 5-year growth curve looked bold. With them, it looked realistic. That distinction matters when you're accountable to shareholders. Around 6:30 p.m., my phone buzzed. IT was Claire, our VP of Compliance. You okay? She asked. That alone told me everything. Define okay, I replied as she exhaled slowly. The board was confused. About the growth projections. They don't align with the draft audit summary. There it was. I closed my eyes briefly, because they're not the same model, I said quietly. Silence. Emily, Claire said carefully, did Richard adjust your forecast? Yes. Another silence, heavier this time. That's bold. Corporate language for reckless. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. 6:45 a.m. The office was quiet, fluorescent lights humming faintly. I logged into the audit portal. The finalized Q3 report had been uploaded internally. Opened it. Page 1, Executive Summary. Page 4, Expense Reductions. Page 7, Operating Margin Recovery. And there it was. My model, not his, the conservative projections. The flagged risk variables. The moderated 5-year outlook. The auditors had rejected the inflated numbers, because auditors don't operate on ego either, they operate on documentation. And mine was airtight. By 9:12 a.m. The executive team had access to the report. By 9:47 a.m. my inbox started filling. Subject lines like asterisk clarification on projections, asterisk forecast alignment question, asterisk board follow-up at 10:03 a.m. Richard called me into his office. He didn't ask. He summoned. His office overlooked the Hudson, all glass and expensive restraint. He was standing when I walked in. That report, he said flatly. Yes? Why doesn't it match what was presented? I met his gaze evenly because the auditors reviewed the documented model. His jaw flexed. You could have aligned it. Aligned it, meaning altered the official filing to support his narrative. I won't manipulate audited forecasts, I said calmly. His voice dropped lower. You embarrassed me. There it was, not concern about shareholder trust, not concern about accuracy, embarrassment. I didn't speak during the meeting. I reminded him, that's not the point. Of course it wasn't, because the numbers had spoken instead. There's something people misunderstand about corporate power. IT isn't loud, it's subtle, it's built on perception. And perception fractures quickly when data contradicts narrative. By noon, 3 board members had requested a follow-up call, not with Richard, with both of us. That distinction mattered. We joined the call at 3:00 p.m. David spoke first. We need clarity, he said plainly. The projections presented Tuesday differ from the audited report. Richard began explaining market optimism, dynamic forecasting, strategic framing. Then David interrupted him. Emily, he said, which version reflects operational reality? The question hung there. Richard's eyes shifted slightly toward me, not warning, not exactly, but measured. This was the moment. I could soften it, or I could state it. The audited report reflects the model I built and documented over the past 6 months, I said. The presentation included upward revenue adjustments that did not incorporate updated risk contingencies. Silence. Board members do not like the phrase did not incorporate risk contingencies. It translates to exposed liability. Were those adjustments documented? Another member asked. No, I replied. I didn't elaborate. I didn't accuse. I didn't need to. Documentation is the sharpest blade in corporate America. The call ended with a request for internal review of forecasting governance. Governance, that word echoed, because governance means oversight, oversight means scrutiny, scrutiny means email trails, and I had every one of them that evening. As I was shutting down my computer, Claire stopped by my office. You handled that with surgical precision, she said. I handled it with facts. She hesitated. You know this won't just fade away. I nodded. I don't want it to. And that was the truth, because something shifted inside me during that board meeting. When Richard said I didn't drive the strategy, something clarified. Had been operating as a builder, but I wasn't positioned as an owner, and there's a difference. Owners get visibility, builders get erased, unless they refuse to be. The next morning, an internal memo went out *** review of forecasting authorization procedures effective immediately. Effective immediately, meaning, someone had noticed Richard avoided eye contact with me all day, not anger, not yet, something closer to calculation. Because he understood what I did, I didn't challenge him publicly, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't send retaliatory emails, I simply let the report speak, and it had spoken clearly. By Friday afternoon, I received an unexpected calendar invite, subject * special executive session, attendance required. No details, just attendees, CEO, board chair, Richard. Me, Monday. 8:00 a.m. I stared at it for a long moment. This wasn't about projections anymore, this was about credibility, and credibility, once questioned at the executive level, rarely returns unchanged. Shut down my laptop and looked out over the city lights flickering on below. 3 years ago, Richard called me his secret weapon. Now I was his biggest variable, and he knew it. The numbers had proven I drove the strategy. But Monday would determine something bigger: who actually owned it. The executive session Monday morning arrived without ceremony. No dramatic sunrise. No thunderstorm. Just a gray Manhattan sky and attention so precise it felt engineered. Got to the office at 7:10 a.m. not because I needed to prepare, I already had, but because I refused to rush into rooms where decisions about my future are being made. The executive conference room was smaller than the main boardroom. More intimate. More dangerous. 8 chairs instead of 12. Frosted glass walls. No skyline view. No audience. The CEO, Mark Reynolds, was already seated when I walked in. Early 60s. Controlled presence. The kind of man who rarely raises his voice because he doesn't need to. The board chair, Evelyn Carter, sat to his right. Sharp. Observant. Former investment banker. She missed nothing. Richard stood near the coffee station. He didn't say good morning. Neither did I. At exactly 8 a.m., the door shut. Mark folded his hands. Let's keep this focused, he said calmly. There's a discrepancy we need to understand. Discrepancy. Such a polite word for what had happened. Evelyn turned toward Richard first. The projections presented last Tuesday differed materially from the audited report, she said. Why? Richard didn't hesitate. Strategic framing, he replied smoothly. Forward-looking positioning. The auditors tend to be conservative. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but the board was not informed those projections were unaudited adjustments. A pause. Richard inhaled slowly. We didn't want to undercut confidence during a recovery phase. Translation. He wanted applause. Mark shifted his attention to me. Emily, he said evenly, did you approve the adjusted projections shown in the meeting? Simple question, simple answer. No silence filled the room like smoke. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mark leaned back slightly. Were you aware they would be presented? No, that landed heavier. Evelyn interjected. Walk us through the origin of the audited model. And so I did, not emotionally, not defensively, just chronologically. 6 months earlier, operational inefficiencies identified. Month 1, vendor contract renegotiations. Month 2, revised forecasting matrix. Month 3, liquidity stabilization strategy. Month 4, debt restructuring alignment. Month 5, margin correction implementation. Month 6, audited documentation and compliance review. Every file timestamped, every adjustment logged. Every risk variable justified. When you remove emotion from the equation, facts become unshakable. Richard tried to interrupt twice. Evelyn held up a hand without looking at him. Let her finish. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't about me defending myself. This was about governance failure. And governance failure threatens investors. Investors threaten boards. Boards threaten CEOs. Suddenly, this was much bigger than one executive's ego. When I finished, Mark nodded once. Why weren't the upward revisions documented? He asked Richard. Richard shifted in his seat. They were directional. That's not an answer, Evelyn said. Silence again. There's a specific kind of quiet that only exists in rooms where power recalibrates. Felt it. Richard looked at me then, not dismissively this time, measured, calculating damage. And then he made his mistake. Emily tends to operate conservatively, he said. She's strong analytically, but strategic vision sometimes requires bold positioning. There it was, the soft undermining, compliment wrapped around condescension. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward me. Is that accurate? I could have defended my ambition. Instead, I did something else. I reached into my folder and slid a single document across the table. It was a memo, dated 6 weeks earlier, subject line ***, projected growth sensitivity, scenario expansion. Richard's signature was at the bottom, approving my recommendation to maintain conservative forward guidance until debt covenants were renegotiated. Mark read it first, then Evelyn. Neither spoke immediately. Richard's face changed color. Just slightly. You approved the conservative model, Mark said slowly. It was a draft discussion, Richard replied. It's signed. No one raised their voice, and no one needed to. Mark closed the folder carefully. Why present a materially different projection to the board? This time, Richard didn't answer immediately, because there wasn't a clean one. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to witness the unraveling. Evelyn spoke again. Emily, in your professional opinion, what risk exposure would the inflated projections create if relied upon by investors? That question mattered. It shifted me from defendant to expert. Potential covenant breach within 12 to 18 months if revenue compression persists, I said evenly. Additionally, credibility loss with institutional shareholders once discrepancies surface. Direct, measured, unemotional. The CEO nodded slowly, and that's when something shifted in the room. I was no longer the supportive contributor. I was the stabilizing authority. Richard sensed it too. He straightened in his chair. I was positioning us for market confidence. At the expense of documented risk? Evelyn asked. No response. The meeting extended another 40 minutes. Questions about authorization, oversight controls, communication protocols. Not once did anyone question my contribution again. Not once. Finally, Mark stood. We'll be conducting a formal review of forecasting governance, he said. Effective immediately, all forward projections require dual sign-off. Dual sign-off meaning, not just Richard, meaning me. Richard's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes hardened. The meeting adjourned. As we stood, Evelyn paused beside me. Good work, she said quietly. Documentation is power. Then she left. Richard lingered. When the room emptied, he turned to me. You blindsided me. I held his gaze calmly. You said I didn't drive the strategy. He didn't deny it. Instead, he said something else. You've made this political. And I finally understood something. Men like Richard believe competence is acceptable, as long as it remains subordinate. The moment it stands independently, it becomes political. I didn't make it political, I said quietly. I made it accurate. He stepped closer. You think this protects you? No, I replied. I think it protects the company. That answer unsettled him more than anything else I could have said, because it removed ego from the equation, and ego was all he had left in this fight. By noon, a second internal memo was circulated. Strategic Finance Oversight Expansion, Senior Director elevated to co-sign authority. Senior Director, that was my title. Elevated. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile, because I knew something important. Power shifts don't happen cleanly, they create fallout, and Richard wasn't done, not yet. But something irreversible had occurred, had publicly minimized my contribution, and the financial report, the audited, documented, verified report, had not only contradicted him, it had elevated me. The numbers had done what I refused to do in that boardroom. They spoke, and now everyone was listening. The counterattack power rarely retreats quietly. It recalibrates, it regroups, and then it tests the perimeter. For about a week after the executive session, things were controlled, too controlled. Richard was polite, professional, almost overly so. He CC'd me on emails he used to bypass me on. He asked for my input in meetings, in that performative tone executives use when optics matter more than collaboration, but underneath it, I could feel it, resentment. Not because I was wrong, but because I had survived, and survival in corporate politics is sometimes more threatening than failure. The formal governance review began that Thursday. Compliance, audit, legal. They requested documentation trails for the past 2 quarters of forecasting communication, provided everything within the hour, time-stamped models, email confirmations, internal memos, approval threads. Richard, I noticed, was slower. 3 days slower. By Monday, rumors started circulating, nothing dramatic, just whispers, finance tension, executive misalignment, board dissatisfaction. Corporate ecosystems thrive on controlled leaks. Then came the first move. An all-hands finance meeting scheduled abruptly for Wednesday morning. Mandatory attendance. No agenda. I knew what that meant, narrative management. The conference room was packed, analysts, managers, directors. 32 people. Richard stood at the front. I took a seat near the middle. He began with calm authority. As you're aware, recent projections required adjustment following audit feedback. Adjustment, interesting word choice. We're implementing new cosign protocols to streamline communication and ensure alignment. Streamline, alignment. He was reframing oversight as collaboration. Classic. Then he looked directly at me. Emily will be supporting these forward-facing initiatives. Supporting, there it was again, a subtle demotion in language, not co-authority, not strategic lead, supporting. I didn't react. I let him continue. Because here's what people misunderstand about reputation. IT isn't shaped in one speech, it's shaped by patterns, and everyone in that room had worked with me. They knew who built the models. They knew who stayed until 10 p.m. They knew whose numbers held up under scrutiny. Perception had already shifted. Richard sensed it, which meant he needed something stronger, and he found it. 2 days later, I was called into HR, subject, leadership feedback review. I almost smiled when I saw it. Retaliation rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives wrapped in policy. The HR director, Melissa, greeted me with professional neutrality. There's been concern about tone in recent executive communications, she began. Tone. I folded my hands calmly. Specific examples? She referenced the executive session. You were described as rigid and uncompromising in strategic discussions. I held her gaze evenly. Is accuracy considered rigidity? Melissa hesitated. That's not the issue. Of course it wasn't. The issue was control. She blindsided leadership. Someone had likely said she escalated unnecessarily. She doesn't understand executive nuance. What they meant was, she didn't stay quiet, asked a simple question. Has there been any concern about the accuracy of my reporting? No. Any compliance violations? No. Any documented performance issues? No. She shifted slightly. Sometimes leadership growth involves soft skills. There it was, the soft penalty for being right. I nodded slowly. I'm happy to participate in leadership development, I said evenly. As long as it's applied consistently across the executive team. That part hung there, because consistency would require examining more than just me. The meeting ended with vague notes about alignment coaching. As I walked back to my office, I felt something crystallize. Richard wasn't trying to disprove my competence anymore, was trying to reframe my credibility as inflexibility, the subtler strategy, and often more effective. But he made one final miscalculation. The governance review concluded the following Tuesday. An official internal report was distributed to executive leadership, received it at 6:12 a.m. Subject line *** forecasting authorization findings. I opened it carefully. Summary * unauthorized projection adjustments were presented to the board. Documentation protocols were bypassed. * approval hierarchy was not followed. * risk disclosures were omitted from presentation materials. Then came the line that changed everything: responsibility for unauthorized modifications attributed to CFO office. CFO office. Richard's office, not strategic finance, not shared oversight. CFO office. There was no ambiguity, no shared blame, and no diluted accountability, and the report recommended * formal reprimand. * executive review. * temporary suspension of sole forecasting authority, temporary, but public. I leaned back in my chair. For a long moment, I didn't move, not because I was shocked, but because I understood what this meant. Corporate reputations aren't destroyed by loud failures, they erode through documented breaches of trust. By 9:30 a.m., the board had been informed. At 11 a.m., another executive session was scheduled. This time, I wasn't invited. At 2:45 p.m., Richard's assistant cleared his calendar for the rest of the week. At 4:10 p.m., an internal announcement was sent, effective immediately. Interim financial oversight responsibilities will be shared between strategic finance and executive operations pending further review. Shared between, not under. My phone buzzed seconds later. Claire, well, she said softly, that escalated. Yes, I replied, it's not final, she added, I know. And I did, because executive exits don't happen overnight, they happen through managed transitions. But something fundamental had shifted. Richard no longer controlled the narrative, was inside it. That evening, as I gathered my things, there was a knock on my office door. It was Mark, the CEO. He didn't step fully inside. Walk with me, he said. He moved down the quiet hallway toward the windows overlooking the river. He spoke without looking at me. You handled this professionally. Thank you. Richard may transition out. May, corporate language again, regardless of outcome, he continued, the board was impressed by your composure. Composure, not aggression, not ambition. Composure. Be prepared, he added. For what? For visibility. And that was when I understood, this wasn't about winning. It was about being undeniable. Richard tried to reduce me to supportive data gathering, tried to paint accuracy as rigidity, tried to reclaim control through narrative management. But the numbers had done something stronger than defend me. They exposed him, and once exposure enters a boardroom, it doesn't leave quietly. It reshapes power. Went home that night not triumphant, not vindicated, just steady. Because I knew Chapter 5 wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about replacement, and whether I wanted it or not, the room was getting ready to call my name. When the room finally said my name, the announcement came on a Thursday, not with drama, not with spectacle, but with a calendar invite, subject line ***, executive transition update, mandatory attendance. 9:00 a.m. main boardroom, all senior leadership present. Didn't sleep much the night before, not because I was anxious, but because I understood something fundamental. When power shifts at the executive level, it doesn't just change titles. IT redraws the map. The boardroom looked the same as it had that Tuesday morning weeks earlier. Glass walls, skyline view, polished walnut table, but the energy was different, quieter, expectant. Richard wasn't there. That was the first confirmation. Mark stood at the head of the table. Evelyn sat beside him. I took a seat halfway down, not at the head, not at the edge, neutral ground. Mark began without preamble. As you're aware, following the governance review, the board has concluded its executive assessment. His voice was steady, effective immediately. Richard Lawson will be stepping down as Chief Financial Officer. There it was. No elaboration. No scandal, just stepping down. In corporate America, that phrase can hold an entire war inside it. The room remained silent, some surprised, some not. Mark continued. During the interim period, the board evaluated leadership continuity within strategic finance. I felt my pulse slow rather than spike, because this wasn't about hope. IT was about preparation. He looked directly at me. The board has unanimously approved the appointment of Emily Carter as interim Chief Financial Officer, effective today. There are moments in life when sound fades. This was one of them, not because I was shocked, but because the memory of that earlier board meeting, when I was told I didn't drive the strategy, flashed through my mind with startling clarity. Interim, temporary, but public and unanimous. I stood slowly, not dramatically, just deliberately. Thank you, I said, voice calm. I'm committed to maintaining financial integrity and long-term stability. Integrity, stability, the same values I had defended weeks earlier. There was light applause, professional, measured, but different from before, because this time, it wasn't for projections. IT was for credibility. After the meeting, executives filtered out quietly. A few stopped to shake my hand. Some offered cautious congratulations. Claire hugged me briefly in the hallway. Documentation is power, she whispered. I smiled. Yes, it is. But here's the part no one sees from the outside. Becoming CFO isn't a victory lap. Exposure, scrutiny multiplied by 10. It's loneliness. By noon, my inbox had exploded. Investor relations, legal briefings, audit schedules, press holding statements, press. The market would be informed by close of business. Leadership transition in a publicly traded company always moves stock prices, and stock prices measure confidence. At 3:30 p.m., I joined Mark and Evelyn for a press preparation call. We'll position this as strategic evolution, Mark said. Continuity, governance strength, internal promotion. Internal promotion. I thought about that phrase. 3 weeks earlier, I was supportive. Now I was continuity. Narratives shift fast when backed by evidence. Evelyn looked at me carefully. You'll likely be asked about the projection discrepancy. I'll answer factually, I said. Good, she replied. No emotion. No blame. That part was easy, because I didn't feel triumphant. I felt responsible. The official press release went live at 4:01 p.m. By 4:17 p.m., the stock had stabilized, not skyrocketed, not crashed. Stabilized. It's how you know investors approve. They don't panic, they wait. At 5:40 p.m., my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It was Richard. His message was short. I suppose congratulations are in order. No bitterness in his tone, but no warmth either. I hope you understand what this role costs. Clicked. I stared at the phone for a long moment, then I deleted the message, because he was right about one thing: leadership costs, but so does silence. That night, I stayed late in the office, not because I had to, but because I wanted to sit in the reality of it. Walked into the CFO office for the first time alone. It felt larger than my previous office, quieter. The city lights reflected against the glass walls. Placed my bag down slowly. Ran my hand across the desk, and I remembered that moment in the board meeting. She didn't really drive the strategy. I sat in the chair, opened my laptop, pulled up the original Q3 model, the one I built, the one that held, the one that told the truth. There's something important I've learned through all of this. Corporate power isn't seized in dramatic speeches, earned in invisible hours, and spreadsheets no one applauds, and documentation no one notices until it matters. Richard didn't fall because I exposed him, he fell because he underestimated the weight of evidence, and because he believed authority outranked accuracy. IT doesn't, not sustainably. The following week, I addressed the entire finance division, standing in front of 32 employees, same room where he called me supportive. I looked at them, analysts, managers, directors. I want to be clear about something. I said our role is not to create optimism. It's to create clarity. You could feel the shift. We will never adjust numbers to protect ego. We adjust strategy to protect reality. Silence, then nods, and in that moment, I understood the real reviravolta. IT wasn't the title. IT wasn't the press release. IT wasn't Richard stepping down. IT was this. The same room that once watched me be minimized now watched me lead, not loudly, not vindicatively, but undeniably. Weeks later, the board voted to remove the interim permanent CFO, unanimous again, no drama, just confirmation. Sometimes I think back to that Tuesday morning in October, the navy blazer, the polished table, the sentence meant to reduce me. And I realized something almost ironic. He hadn't claimed I'd contributed nothing. If he hadn't erased me publicly, if he hadn't altered those projections, none of this would have happened. Tried to diminish my visibility. Instead, he accelerated it, because when the financial report proved him wrong, it didn't just correct the numbers. IT corrected the hierarchy, and the room that once went silent when he spoke, now goes silent when I do, not out of fear, but out of trust, and that is the kind of power no one can take credit for.